Okay, so I will introduce briefly Yehonatan Carmeli, and then we'll listen to his lecture by Zoom. Yehonatan Carmeli is a PhD candidate at Middle Eastern Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University. His research interests include relationships between Abrahamic religions, the history of pre-Islamic Arabs, and the history of circumcision in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and ancient Egypt. His dissertation is on the origins and meanings of circumcision in early Islam. The topic of his lecture today is circumcision in pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islam.
Hello, everybody, and good morning. My name is Yehonatan Carmeli, and I am a PhD candidate in the Middle Eastern Studies Department in Bar-Ilan University. My PhD dissertation topic is circumcision in pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islam, and it's going to be also the topic that we're going to discuss here together. So today we will survey many textual sources about the custom of circumcision in Arabia during the centuries before the rise of Islam. Then we will assert that verse 124 in the second surah of the Qur'an, Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, allude to the biblical precept of circumcision, but present the practice as a custom that has no special features and certainly not those the Jews ascribe to it. We will first begin the circumcision in pre-Islamic Arabia. Arabic has three different words for circumcision: khitan, adr, and khaft. The last of these, khaft, is used mainly for female circumcision. Its literal sense is removal or reduction. Adr may preserve a memory of circumcision as a sacrifice intended to protect the individual. The root adr carries the senses of the circumcision cut, virgin, and excuse. The last meaning may indicate a view of circumcision as a way to appease the deity and ensure his protection of the circumcised person. As for khitan, it has been related to the biblical locution Khatan Damim, a bridegroom of blood, the term employed by Tzipporah the Midianite after she circumcised her son at the lodging place. Inasmuch as in Hebrew, Arabic, Akkadian, and Ugaritic, the root khatana designates the bride's father as well as the groom, some believe that the phrase indicates circumcision as a premarital rite in Canaanite and Arab cultures. Others counter that the locution means that circumcision was seen as a means to protect against demons, evil spirits, or a wrathful deity. Whatever the case, given that Exodus 4 describes a voluntary action by Tzipporah, it may reflect an ancient Midianite belief about the role of circumcision and indirectly indicate that the Midianites circumcised their sons at some opportunity or other. Of course, biblical traditions should not be presumed to be reliable historical sources. However, they still can echo perceptions of Arabs as circumcised at the time when the Bible was composed. If so, this biblical account may be the earliest attestation of circumcision among Arabs, given that the Bible makes the Midianites inhabit the Western Arabian Peninsula and the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, this is not the only biblical passage in which Arabs are circumcised. Genesis tells us that Ishmael was circumcised by his father, but also emphasizes his exclusion from the covenant. And we will discuss this topic in more details in what follows. On the other hand, there is another source that indirectly shows that the Arabs did not practice circumcision in the period when the Bible was composed. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus did not include them in his list of nations that practiced the custom: the Colchians, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Phoenicians, and the Syrians who dwell in Palestine, as well as several nations in Asia Minor. Many scholars have maintained that some Arab groups in the Arabian Peninsula practiced circumcision before the advent of Islam. They do so on the basis of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources. Some of this evidence derives from historical sources, especially biblical accounts and other sources based upon them, and so the conclusions that arise from them should be deemed tentative. Yet, collecting all the available evidence may provide a relatively comprehensive description of circumcision in pre-Islamic Arabia. According to the Book of Jubilees, written about the 2nd century BCE, before his death, Abraham instructed Ishmael and his 12 sons, and Isaac and his 2 sons, and the 6 sons of Keturah to adhere to God's precepts, including to, quote, circumcise their sons in the covenant which he, which means God, had made with them, end of quote. The author's emphasis that the descendants of Hagar and Keturah were enjoined to circumcise their sons may indicate that the Arab tribes then living east of the Jordan follow this custom. In the first book of the Antiquities, Flavius Josephus, 1st century CE, writes explicitly that the Arab deferred the ceremony of the 13th year because Ishmael, the founder of their race, born of Abraham's concubine, was circumcised at that age, end of quote. This statement seems to be based on biblical account. Similarly, Philo of Alexandria stated that the Egyptians, Arabs, and Ethiopians are circumcised. Christian authors of the 2nd and 3rd centuries wrote that the Arab practiced circumcision. The Epistle of Barnabas, dated to the early 2nd century, dismissed circumcision as nugatory inasmuch as the Syrians, Arabs, pagan priests, and Egyptians all do so. Bardasian, a Syrian or Parthian scholar, recounts that the Romans banned many local customs after they conquered the Arabian Peninsula, including circumcision. The church father Origen, in his apologetic dialogue Contra Celsum, wrote that the Jews distinguished their circumcision, quote, not only from that of the Colchians and Egyptians, but also from that of Ishmaelites Arab, even though Ishmael was born of their forefather Abraham and was circumcised with him, end of quote. The church historian Philostorgius wrote that the inhabitants of the kingdom of Himar in southern Arabia circumcised their sons on the 8th day after birth. Eusebius, the archbishop of Caesarea, reported that the Ishmaelites in the province of Arabia were circumcised at age 13. The Syriac author Aphrahat reported that the descendants of Ishmael and Keturah practiced circumcision even though they were pagans. The church father Epiphanius of Salamis reported that, quote, the Saracens, also called Ishmaelites, have circumcision, and the Samaritans, Idumeans, and Humerites. Most of these do this not because of a law, but from some senseless custom, end of quote. The 5th century Byzantine historian Sozomen wrote that the Saracens emulate many Jewish customs, among them circumcision and abstaining from pork. In a Qasida attributed to Imrul Qais, a 6th century Arab prince and poet, died in 544, he quotes what he told the Roman emperor one day when they entered the bathhouse together. Quote, I solemnly swear, I'm not lying, you are not circumcised because the moon did not appear, end of quote. According to Muslim scholars, this is an allusion to an ancient Arab tradition that a man born on the night of a full moon is born without a foreskin. As we see, at least 12 texts refer to practice of circumcision by Midianites, Himerites, Arabs, Ishmaelites, and Saracens in pre-Islamic antiquity, roughly from the start of the last millennium BCE through the mid-7th century CE. Note, however, that many of these sources stick closely to the biblical account, refer to the Arabs as Ishmaelites or descendants of Ishmael, and emphasize the link between the customs of the Arabs and those of the Jews. Hence, it is hard to know whether all of these testimonies are based on first-hand observation or merely parrot the biblical history. Still, the large number of these reports, along with accounts of historical events that did not rely on the biblical tradition, will seem to bolster the reliability of the overall picture they present. Hence, we can infer that the Arabs in general, and especially the tribes of the southern and eastern Arabian Peninsula, practiced circumcision before Muhammad. As has been noted in the past, however, the rite was not practiced then by all the tribes of the peninsula. In general, the Muslim tradition described the ancient Arabs as a nation of circumcision, Ummat al-Khitan, and maintained that some of them believed in the religion of Abraham, Millat Ibrahim, whose customs include circumcision. Non-Muslim sources from the 7th century also refer to the religion of Abraham, one of whose precepts was circumcision. It is hard to know why the Arabs would have practiced circumcision before Muhammad. The Arabic terms for the procedure suggest that it may have been seen as an apotropaic ritual. The accounts that draw on Genesis link it to the Jews. directly or indirectly. Some have asserted that the Arabs circumcised their sons as a matter of hygiene, but this idea is not supported by ancient sources, even though it is compatible with Islamic tradition's view of circumcision. We may conjecture that circumcision among the Arabs had other virtues, such as tribal identity and adulthood. These are aspects of circumcision customs in many places around the world, but in the absence of specific evidence, this remains only a conjecture. Now we'll discuss circumcision in early Islam. Given that Arabs practiced circumcision before Islam, the Qur'an's silence about circumcision is somewhat enigmatic. Aware of this, Muslim scholars of the early Middle Ages interpreted several verses, notably verse 124 of the second surah of the Qur'an, the chapter of the cow, Surah Al-Baqarah, as references to the precept of circumcision. This verse reports that Abraham was tested with certain words. Quote, and when his Lord tested Abraham with certain words, kalimat, and he fulfilled them, he said, behold, I make you a leader for the people, imam linnas. Said he, Abraham, and of my seed? He said, my covenant, ahdi, shall not reach the evildoers. End of quote. Doubts about an original link between this and other verses and the precept of circumcision are prominent in studies of circumcision in Islam. Some scholars assert that the inclusion of circumcision among the precepts of the religion of Abraham, Milat Ibrahim, and as one of the words, kalimat, with which Abraham was tested, is a later development to be identified especially with the commentator and historian Muhammad al-Tabari and with medieval jurists and scholars in general. I believe, however, that the identification of circumcision as one of those words is already present in the Quran itself, inasmuch as Quran 2:124 sounds like a reworking of the biblical account of Abraham's circumcision in Genesis 17. There are many common elements in the two texts. I also see similar terminology, which indicate that Quran 2:124 is a response to the circumcision pericope in Genesis. In Genesis 17, the Lord commands Abraham to, quote, walk in my ways and be blameless, end of quote. The Lord then tells Abraham that he is making a covenant with him. Abraham will circumcise all males of his family, both the homeborn and purchased slaves. For his part, the Lord will multiply his descendants, who will include kings, make him the father of multitude of nations, assign Canaan to him and his descendants, and be their God. When Abraham requests that this covenant apply to Ishmael, God replies, quote, I will establish my covenant with Isaac, unquote. In other words, the covenant of circumcision will apply only to Isaac and not to Ishmael. Now let us return to the second surah of the Quran. Verse 124 begins with the test to which God subjected Abraham. The Quran does not provide details of this trial, other than that it was a test by kalimat. If this is taken to mean words, as Arbery translated, rather than things, the other common sense of the word, we learn that Abraham fulfilled all the words he was commanded, and that God promised to make him a leader for the people. In response, Abraham requests that God's blessing apply not only to himself, but also to his offspring. God does not agree in full. The covenant, ahd, is only with the righteous and not with the evildoers. This is the first indication here that a divine covenant is involved. We see then that the Quran, like Genesis, describes a divine covenant with Abraham. Abraham withstands the test to which he is put, and God promises that he will be a leader for men. The covenant excluded the evildoers among Abraham's offspring. Thus, there is a correspondence between the four elements of the two accounts. First, the trial, circumcision in Genesis versus words in the Quran. Second, the promise. In Genesis, Abraham will be the father of many nations. In the Quran, Abraham will be a leader for the people, Imam Linas. Third, the question in Genesis concerning Ishmael versus in the Quran concerning his seed in general. And fourth and last, the divine answer in Genesis, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac alone, versus in the Quran, my covenant shall not reach the evildoers. Even though nothing in Quran 2:124 can be used to identify the evildoer's descendant from Abraham, we can infer the identity from the next four verses. This recounts how Abraham and Ishmael purified and raised up the foundations of the house of Allah, the Kaaba in Mecca, quote, for those that shall go about it and those that cleave to it, to those who bow and prostrate themselves, unquote. Next comes the prayer uttered by Abraham and Ishmael, quote, "Our Lord, make us submissive to thee," in Arabic, Muslimin laka, "and of our seed a nation submissive to thee, Umma Muslima laka," end of quote. Allah's response is not reported. In other words, when Abraham alone asked that the covenant include his descendants, Allah's reply limited its coverage. But when Abraham and Ishmael jointly asked that their seed be a nation submissive to him, there is no answer, but no reservation either. I read this as an allusion to the rejection of Isaac's descendants from the covenant between God and Abraham. This fits very well with the original story that these verses of the Quran are retelling. In Genesis 17, it is Ishmael who is excluded from the covenant. In Quran 2:124, it is Isaac who is excluded. Overall, this surah focuses on the arguments of the Christians and Jews that only their religion laws are valid. The function of Quran 2:124, with the emphasis on God's rejection of the Jews, stands out in the context, and especially when compared with the verse right before and after it. Quran 2:122 addresses the children of Israel directly and reminds them that God, quote, "preferred you above all beings." Quran 2:134 addresses Muhammad's audience and tells them that the Jews are, quote, "a nation that has passed away." Quran 2:124 annuls the Jews' narratives of the chosen people and leads to the statements that they have become of no account. Thus, the passage of Abraham test with words and the renovation of the Kaaba by Abraham and Ishmael is embedded in their books to the Jews and Christians for having abandoned Abraham's path. The Quran's desire to emphasize the importance of Ishmael stands out thanks to his inclusion alongside Abraham and Isaac. In the past, prominent scholars tended to minimize the importance that the Quran as a whole, and Quran 2 in particular, assigned to genealogy and preference of Ishmael's descendants to Isaac's. This is because they have been persuaded that Islam abandoned the chains of genealogy and created the universal religion. On the other hand, Mohsen Gudarzi did not accept this overlooking of the genealogy in Quran 2:124. He analyzed this verse as expressing the hope that the Ishmaelites will continue the Abrahamic covenant in place of the Jews. He maintains that although the Quran presents Islam as a universal religion, it is nevertheless emphasizes the special status of the Arab ethnos within it. The intertextual links between Quran 2:124 and Genesis 17 suit his thesis. If so, we should read this verse as a sort of paraphrase of the biblical history. Abraham was indeed circumcised and became a leader for men, but it is Ishmael who was the chosen son, not Isaac, and, for theory, his descendants the Jews. As we have seen, Quran 2:124 may allude to circumcision, but it does not state it as a religious precept. Circumcision is referred to vaguely as a test that Abraham passed as part of the divine covenant with him, and not as a binding obligation for his descendants or for those to whom the Quran is addressed. In other words, the Quran does not seem to have wanted to emphasize the essential nature of circumcision for Muslims, but rather to deny that it had the special powers that Jews assigned to it. As such, the Quran rejected the linkage of circumcision and the covenant and stressed that the covenant is a matter of faith and righteous behavior, and hence will not reach the evildoers, even, it seems, if they are circumcised. The Quran expands the Lakushan Milat Ibrahim to include the spiritual rather than physical aspects. It is important to emphasize that Quran 2:124 alludes to circumcision and emphasizes it of its biblical virtues, even though Muhammad's audience evidently did practice the rite. What is more, the Quran used the phrase "our uncircumcised heart," Qulubna Ghulf, on two separate occasions, one of them in Quran 2. In both instances, it occurs in a passage where the Jews are speaking of themselves, perhaps echoing the biblical reference to the Israelites uncircumcised of heart. But even if the phrase is a rhetorical flourish borrowed from the Bible, the Quran's use of the metaphor to indicate a closed mind surely means that the original audience of the Quran practiced the rite, or at least were familiar with it. In other words, the Quran does not criticize circumcision or call for an end to the ritual, but at the same time, it declares that no special virtue is attached to it. This ambivalence about circumcision may reflect the tension between holding on to ancient Arab customs on the one hand, and the borrowing of biblical narratives on the other. while severing the link between the Muslim community and Judaism. It is important to remember that unlike Paul, who explicitly denounced circumcision as worthless, the Quran was not addressed to an uncircumcised audience, so abrogation of the rite will not be catalyst for the expansion of the new religion and spread of its message. But the biblical account states that circumcision is a sign of the covenant between Abraham and God, a covenant from which Ishmael was explicitly excluded. In other words, the Jewish covenant of circumcision functions as a symbol of the preference of the favorite son, Isaac, over the rejected son, Ishmael. This tension may have been in the background of the Qur'an's ambivalence about the custom, a general reprise of the biblical narrative on the one hand, but a denial of the special virtues it attaches to circumcision on the other hand. Gabriel Said Reynolds maintains that the words with which God tested Abraham refer to binding of Isaac, described in Genesis 22. His proof is that the mention of Abraham and his test is followed by Abraham and Ishmael's rebuilding of the Kaaba. Reynolds acknowledges that one motif found in Qur'an 2:124 is totally absent from Genesis 22, the exclusion of the evildoers from the divine covenant with Abraham. As noted above, this parallels Ishmael's exclusion from the covenant of circumcision described in Genesis 17. It is not impossible, however, that by words, the Quran had both biblical stories in mind, the covenant of circumcision and the binding of Isaac. Both stories focus on the election of Isaac rather than Ishmael. This may be why Quran 2:124 does not mention circumcision explicitly, but only the words with which God tested Abraham, so that the reference to both stories will be clearer. All the same, the Quran's reference to Genesis 17 and 22 is certainly an outlier. In general, the Quran expands biblical stories and adds details to them, but here a single verse, Quran 2:124, encapsulates an entire chapter. Most conspicuous is the Quran's use of the vague locution tested with words. The Bible certainly does describe the binding of Isaac as a test, but the Quran referred to tests in the plural without enumerating them. If Quran 2:124 does in fact refer to Genesis 17 and 22, why is there no explicit mention of the covenant of circumcision and of the binding of Isaac? Why the nebulous language? There are a number of passages, and especially in Quran 2, where the Quran drew on Tanaitic traditions. Therefore, as I read it, the phrasing of Quran 2:124, when his Lord tested Abraham with certain words and he fulfilled them, is a close fit for the statement in the Mishnah, quote, "With 10 trials was Abraham our father tested, and he stood steadfast in them all. Ve'amad b'chulam," i.e. fulfilled them, end of quote. Like the Quran, the Mishnah offers no enumerations of those trails, evidently assuming that its readers were familiar with them from Genesis. Similarly, the words of verse 124 denote multiple occasions when God put Abraham to the test. The rabbinic tradition of Abraham's trials evidently passed through multiple versions in a process that continued until well into the Middle Ages. In fact, this tradition is already present in the Book of Jubilees, written in the 2nd century BCE. It refers to 6 trials that Abraham withstood, including the covenant of circumcision and the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Quote, "And the Lord knew that Abraham was faithful in all of his afflictions, for he had tried him through his country and with famine, and had tried him with the wealth of kings, and had tried him again through his wife when she was torn from him, and with circumcision, and had tried him through Ishmael and Hagar, his maidservant, when he sent them away. And in everything wherein he had tried him, he was found faithful, and his soul was not impatient, and he was not slow to act, for he was faithful and a lover of the Lord." End of quote. Note that this verse immediately preceded the account of the binding of Isaac in chapter 18, which was yet another trial for Abraham. Counting this last, Jubilees notes for only 7 tests of Abraham, whereas the Mishnah counts 10 of them. So the Mishnah, or a Christian apocryph text belonging to the big family of Jewish or Christian post-biblical texts, may lie behind the language of Qur'an 2:124. In particular, it lends support to the idea that the phrase "His Lord tested Abraham with certain words" would have sounded familiar to the audience of the Qur'an. Studies of the sources from which the Qur'an drew Jewish or Christian narratives and concepts conclude that they were oral rather than written. This explains how the Qur'an can conflate biblical and post-biblical sources without distinction among them. They were all known through oral tradition only. My argument that Qur'an 2:124 drew on Genesis 17 as well as on the Mishnah in Avot is based on the idea that these traditions, like many others, were passed down orally in Jewish or Arab monotheistic communities before Muhammad and were accordingly known to the author of the Qur'an and perhaps even to his audience. To sum up, Qur'an 2:124 opens with an extra-biblical tradition which exists in multiple versions of the many trials that Abraham had to endure, including circumcision, the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar, and the binding of Isaac. Next, the verse offers a brief summary of the dialogue between God and Abraham in Genesis 17. In this way, the verse severes the bond between Abraham and the descendants of Isaac, the Jews, and even more so, the link between Abraham's trials, including circumcision, and his covenant with God. Thank you for listening, and I hope to hear your questions about the lecture, about the topic, about everything that's been discussed here today. But again, thank you.
Thank you, thank you very much, Yehonatan, for your presentation. And you are invited.
In your bibliography, you mention a great number of hadith collections and commentaries on the Quran. But in your written article, there is barely any reference to this material. Maybe that in that material, your conclusions may be changed to some extent.
In my research, as you said, I used many sources from hadith and tafsir, the commentators of the Quran, and many other oral traditions. And in my overall research, I investigated how the early Muslim community understood circumcision and how the early community of Islam interpreted this verse of Quran 2:124. And I realized that there was some kind of shift between the 7th and 8th centuries, where commentators started to suggest circumcision as one of the tests in which Abraham was tested, and also many traditions in the 7th and 8th centuries, circumcision has been taken as one of the tested, or one of the precepts which the Arabs monotheistic community practiced before Muhammad. So it's very fits to the idea that circumcision was practiced before the advent of Islam, and also that it has no special virtues. In this kind of way, it remains as it was in the very early stages of Islam till today.
Other questions? Yes, David, yes.
Thank you, Yehonatan, for a very interesting presentation. My question is about Muhammad. Apparently the Quran doesn't say anything about whether or not Muhammad was circumcised, although I'm sure that the Islamic tradition and the Hadith do. What can you tell us about that and how it connects to what you've just shared with us?
Thank you for your question. Yes, it's not a lot of Islamic traditions that speaks about Muhammad's being circumcised, but there are some few traditions speaking about it. One of those said that Muhammad was born circumcised. They're very interesting and very interesting article written by Milka Levy-Rubin about this topic, that Muhammad was born circumcised. although there are others Muslim traditions speaking that Muhammad was circumcised by his grandfather in the Kaaba in Mecca. But I have to say that all of those traditions are very late in the development of Muslim tradition literature in general. And also there are very few traditions speaking about it. So the few traditions describe circumcision to Muhammad speaks about that Muhammad circumcised his two Al-Hassan wal-Hussein, which he was their uncle, and not about that him was been circumcised by himself. So there are a few traditions and very late ones, but there are. So thank you for the question. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting and broad paper. I'd like to ask you, do you think did you find any reference to the fact that circumcision was rejected by Christianity? Do you think this played any role in the attitude of Islam towards circumcision?
Very important and interesting question. Thank you. Actually, there is in the commentators of the Quran about the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, verse 138, if I remember it correctly. It's speaking about Sibrat Allah, a very strange locution found in the Quran, which many commentators offer different solutions for this vaguely locution. So this Sibrat Allah been some commentators in the 7th or 8th and 9th centuries offer that Sibrat Allah it's actually the baptizing of the Christians, and they're saying that against the baptizing of the Christianity, the Islam offers Sibrat Allah, which is the baptizing of Allah, of God, which is circumcision or the religion of Islam in general. So there is specifically commentators that speaks about the difference between circumcision and baptizing in Christianity. But in general, we have to say that Islam preserved the perception of being baptizing as part of being becoming an Islamic, a Muslim. If some people around the world want to be Muslim, they have to purify themselves by baptizing or something similar to it. So actually, Islam preserved the meaning of being baptizing, but in this particular verse, it offers that circumcision is against the baptizing of Christianity and something that is better than it. And there is no one of those commentators suggesting that circumcision is also a perception which connected to the Jews. It's something that nobody is mentioned. I think almost none of the commentators and the Hadith speaks about the Jews that have been circumcised, unless for some particular cases. And thank you for the question.
Yeah, sorry, I may not have understood you correctly when you were in your talk, but did you distinguish between traditions from the 7th and the 8th century? Because in the previous talk by Pavel, he explained, and we know the problematic of dating these, or the authenticity of traditions of the 1st century.
Yeah, of course, I'm not speaking here about traditions in the 7th century. I'm speaking about commentators in the 7th century, specifically Mujahid ibn Jabr and Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, and those kind of commentators would not offer a circumcision as one of the tests in which Abraham was tested. But other later commentators offer circumcision as one of the tests that Abraham was in which he was tested, and those commentators appear in the late 8th and 9th century, and so on and so forth, till the 10th and 11th centuries. Commentators started to offer more and more circumcision as one of the tests in which Abraham was tested. But this phenomena was not of those commentators worked in the early 7th, 6th centuries. Of course, as you mentioned, there are some arguments against the authenticity of those works, and I consider these arguments in my research. But it's something that's very interesting to see that the most early commentators did not designate circumcision as one of the tested, in which Abraham was tested.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A really, really interesting talk. And I see that you state that Quran, Surah Baqarah, Ayah 124, review on Genesis 17, as well as on the Mishnah in Avot. And it is based on the idea that these traditions and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this expression that the Quran drew on these sources is very interesting, because to me, it suggests a process of conscious composition, not so much process of revelation, for instance. So I wouldn't argue that this is revelation. This is not my point of argument, of course. But it is interesting to me, what is, in your opinion, the milieu in which this kind of influence took place? Is it the early Medinan milieu or another setting, intellectual setting, which may have influenced, I would say, the composition of the Quran in this case? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Very interesting question. In my investigation, in my research, I did not put my attention for the Medinan milieu or the Meccan milieu. I'm offered to investigate those verses dealing with the Jews and calling out to the Jews as something that the author of those verses wanted to draw upon biblical or Christian narratives, was familiar with cultures, with the communities lived there in the Arabian Peninsula. And by drawing upon those narratives and about those ideas to offer the new religion, the new perceptions of Allah, of the one religion and the best religion, Sibrat Allah or Fitra, Fitra, التي خلق الناس عليها. All of those verses found in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Rum. So I offer that those verses composed upon biblical verses or Christian stories that was not actually been known by reading those books, of course, but by oral traditions that those local communities were familiar with, by oral traditions. And because of the familiar of those ideas and narratives, the author of the Quran drew upon them and offer his new agenda, his new religion, his new book.
Can I ask something?
Yes. Ella, go ahead.
Do you have any evidence of the actual practice in early Islam? Was it actually practiced, circumcision, as a continuation of pre-Islam or as anything else? Any evidence of that?
Of circumcision that actually been practiced in the early ages of Islam? This was the question?
Yeah, this is the question.
So of course, there are a few traditions speaking about circumcision in the early ages of Islam. One of the most famous tradition is about the circumcision of female, where Aisha, one of the Prophet's wife and the most beloved one, said, there are many versions of this tradition. She is reported to be said that when the circumcision of the male meets the circumcision of the female, one must have to take bath or take shower to ghusl before he is available to participate in Dabin and Salah. So in this tradition, some scholars offer that this is an indication that circumcision was practiced in the early ages of Islam. So it became a word for the circumcised male, circumcised female in the body. And this one example. There are also some example of traditions that speaks about circumcision celebrations meals that was very special ones. In some of those, there was some drinking of some halal drinks on the limits. And it's very interesting to see that circumcision became to be taken as very special event for males, not for females, of course. So there are indications that circumcision was practiced in the first ages of the Quran. It's not a lot of indications, but there are.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So connected to Ella's question, apparently there's a great variety among Muslim communities with regard to the age at which the male is circumcised. And I wonder why that is the case. You know, as someone who works in Islamic law, sort of these are the details like this are something that are, I mean, they're all, you know, the jurists are always interested in establishing, you know, what the sunnah is, what the practice is, what the procedure is. So what's taking place in Islamic intellectual thought on the subject or the question of when should the male child be circumcised?
Well, first, thank you for this very interesting question. There are some early Muslim tradition speaks about the precise date in which Muslim must to be circumcised in. One of those verses offers the 30 days after the birth. Other tradition speaks about the 7th day after birth, very similar to the 8th day after birth in Judaism, which is quite similar. And also there are tradition speaks about the early adulthood till the 13 age, etc. So there are no standardization of time in early Islam, and especially not in the Sunnah. Although in the Shia, there are many tradition speaks about the importance to circumcise the infants when they are the babies, actually, when they are in the 7th day after birth. But in the Sunnah, there is no standardization of time. And actually, the importance of the exact time to circumcise is very unique to Judaism, not to other other communities practice circumcision, there are more fluidity in the time which you can to be circumcised. And also in Islam, it's very large community, very large religion, and there are a lot of variety between the specific time a man should be circumcised.
Thank you very much, Yehonatan.
Thank you.
For this presentation.